Welcome back. I'm Glenn Parry. I'll be hosting this part of the agenda. I'm from the business school. Thanks in advance for all of you for being here today. It's great to see so many experts, so many people. I'm already recognizing so many different connections, and particularly between yourselves, because this is a small community. It's lovely to see you all here. Where's my clicker? So we've got a series of short talks and then a panel session to discuss the content of today, which is supply chain and digital borders in this session. So as part of this project, this program, I've been very lucky in that I've had a really wonderful team. This is just some of the team we've been able to leverage through this program. It has been exceptional to have such a lot of talent, such a lot of young people that I get to work with, because I'm no longer young. I'm standing here with a very bad back. Hence, I'm propping myself up on this lectern. But actually, I think that one of the real advantages of this program has been to be able to bring through young academics who've engaged with industry and business and really excelled in what they've been able to do. Some of the work we've spoken about work on chocolate, on minerals, on clothing supply, which has been with Mike Rogerson, Alicia, Felipe, Pedro, and Regina's joined us, who's also been part of the clothing work. Trust, resilience, and governance work with DECaDE, with Mike Brookbanks, and with Carla Bonina. We've done work on value, the benefits of blockchain, which has been led by Felipe, working with HMRC. He'll talk about that. We've looked at barriers to adoption. We've had PhD students, Ying. We've had Zhao Tanji. We've had work on paradoxes with Birgit, Maria-Laura, and Mike. We've had work on supply chain trading, digital content, which you'll hear a little bit more about. Today, we've also got work by Car, which John will speak about, and Sadiq will talk about reputation and privacy. We've also got ongoing work, which is a deep dive into AI and blockchain. That work's not presented today, but we can talk about that going forward, focusing on supply chains. We have Shishu is sitting there at the back. We've got Navod, Felipe, and Mike, really looking at those interactions between those technologies. So I think what this program's allowed us to do is really develop talent. And that's been a real privilege for me to be able to lead some of that work. Now, a lot of the work that we've been doing and really pushing on is trying to develop a digital trade border. And this has been, spearheaded by some of the early work by Mike, and the whole team have really been engaging with that. And we've got quite a number of people in the room who've been pushing on this. This is the sort of timeline on that. We've run 4 workshops on digital borders at HMRC, Cabinet Office, border agencies, all sorts of people have engaged. We've talked at the House of Lords. We've had 4 APPGs. We've had work in government strategy documentation. You can see here, this is the timeline of the sort of changes from the Digital Economy Act, the Reducing Friction International Trade work Mike led, UK border strategy document. Then in the middle of all of this, do you remember we left the EU? And then there's been a number of pilots. There's been the single trade window work, which has sadly just come to an end, but we're hoping to push that through. And I'm asking all of you, if you see any of these projects, please engage, please push towards this UK digital trade border. There's been a number of changes in the law that we've been supporting, the Electronic Trade Documents Act, Data Protection Bill, the UK Border Trade Operating Model. Then there was an election in the middle of our project when I thought we were making grand progress, which Nick will be very familiar with. And so that was last government, and now we've got a new government, and they want to start again. So I've learned a lot about policy, about trying to implement change at scale. So this is translated into new data use access bill, new trade strategy. Well, it looks quite similar to the old trade strategy, but with a new sticker on the top. New UK government strategy. So a real learning curve for me on that. quite how difficult it is to drive change. But lots of change has happened, and I really think we can get there, because we're talking about trillions of pounds worth of trade a day, both physical and digital goods. And that's the sort of thing we're going to talk about today, because that's been our focus. So, as I mentioned, this is a panel session applying the decentralized technologies that we've been investigated, been interested in, to supply chain in digital and physical goods. So we've got this small series of 5-minute talks. I will wave at you because I'm familiar. These are academics who'll be talking, and it takes them 5 minutes to draw breath before they start speaking. So to begin with, I'll ask Mike Brookbanks to come up and talk in more detail about our work supporting the UK Digital Trade Border. Thanks, Mike. There's a clicker.
Thanks. Right. A few more of those coming out. Good morning. My name is Mike Brookbanks. I'm not one of the younger people, but I am a relatively new academic. I used to work in industry for IBM, and I was director of a number of technology companies before I entered academia, probably in about 2017. 2018, I began work with Lord Holmes of Richmond with regards to this program called Reducing Friction in International Trade. What it was a collaboration originally between Exeter, UCL, and Surrey. Over a period of time, that turned into a program that started in 2019. And really what we were looking at was how do digital technologies enable trade, so cross-border trade. It delivered early 2020 as a project, and as Chris or Lord Holmes mentioned, there was an update to his report citing the RFIT program, and it also featured within the overall border strategy, the 2025 government border strategy. So it had quite a lot of high focus as a project. From the 2025 border strategy, then a number of other collaborative programs were generated by government, by the Cabinet Office predominantly, Ecosystem of Trust and the Border Trade Demonstrators. Also generated from the 2025 border strategy was the Single Trade Window Programme, which, as Glenn said, has now formally ceased. Whereas the original piece of RFIT was a technology project. It was looking at how these technologies enable business. We gained insight, and we started gaining insight from the importers with it and producers within the supply chain. And they provided us insight into some of the benefits, the economic benefits of those programs. I don't have much time, but I will just articulate what we did from a supply chain perspective. We looked at the end-to-end supply chain. So we were looking at the producer right through to the wine importer and the consumer. But we're also looking at the interaction with government. So RFIT as a program was the collaboration between government, academia, industry, and technology companies. It dived into, in effect, that, if you can see it, a blue line across the middle. It built a integrated layer of information between the producer and the consumer. But it also had to start looking at the vertical, because that's largely where a lot of the frictions were coming from, because producers or wine importers want to get wine as fast as possible. Unfortunately, they've got Customs and Excise, HMRC, they've got the food standards agencies, they've got bonded warehouses, they've got freight forwarders, all these people to deal with. So leading on from this RFIT project and program, I started researching a number of areas. One was trust, second one was resilience. So how do these technologies change supply chain trust in individuals and resilience? And latterly I've been looking at governance of this transformation. What's clear from the work and the research is nobody is orchestrating change. There's no single person controlling a end-to-end strategic vision. And I say end-to-end strategic vision, because you've got to look at it from the producer right through to the consumer, not part of it. So technology companies like IBM, TradeLens, etc., looked at part of it. What is key is underlying this orchestration is identity, reputation management, and looking at value creation. I keep on getting signs that I have to stop. So the final point is the research, though, lends itself very well for looking at agentic AI and blockchain technology and how these can be combined to deliver value to the end-to-end supply chain.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Glenn, for the introduction. So building on what Mike just presented, I'm going to continue sharing some of the work that we've been doing at DECaDE on cross-border trade and trade digitalization. So what I'm going to present is this comprehensive exercise that we do to try to put together how these benefits accumulate from the very micro effect at the firm level all the way up to macroeconomic impacts on economic growth, for instance. And the motivation is straightforward. What we've seen is several government-led initiatives and also industry reports and initiatives that we've seen that show the potential benefit of these technologies. However, we think that there is still a space for academics to contribute and put together, a bigger picture of this. So what we did is, in this specific work, we worked very closely with HMRC in the ETDA technical demonstrator, providing an external evaluation of the potential benefits that we saw in this exercise. And the way we organize it is, I'm going to start presenting you the very micro evidence, firm level evidence that we found. And the way we did this is working directly with pilot participants in basically identifying the cost or the time reductions that they face by moving from paper traditional type of trade to a more digitalized exercise. So what we saw is that the processing time of documents went down significantly. There is a lot of evidence that we've seen that show how this happens in the supply chains. However, we also did the exercise on what is the impact on cost reduction for these firms. And what we find is that it goes from 60 to 80% in terms of processing costs. Basically, this is by measuring the labor cost that it takes to process these documents in this way. And this is kind of evidence that we've seen before and that we are aware of. More importantly, what we found in this exercise is this potential to reduce errors, mistakes, resubmission of declaration, basically because information now lives in systems that speak to each other in this way. So that's kind of the micro evidence that we found. Then we move to more, and the question is, what is the effect on the trade ecosystem? And for that, what we did is a meta-analysis of academic research and industry reports on putting together all of this evidence. So we call this the trade ecosystem kind of layer of this. And what we find, again, is like consistent evidence that shows, for instance, how there is reduction in documentary compliance, border compliance, which we are aware of, and the numbers are significant in this space. But more importantly, what we saw is that there is a lot of potential for small and medium-sized enterprises to actually get the benefit of these new technologies at scale. So, processes like trade finance and how SMEs access bigger markets is kind of the main effects that we saw, and we kind of discussed this within the pilot with many participants. This is particularly important when nowadays we are seeing the effect of Brexit on these type of businesses, right? So I think that one of the conclusions that we put up in this report is this idea that there is a lot of potential for SMEs to kind of, mitigate the potential negative effects that have been documented recently in academic venues and industry exercises. So, and finally, just to move to the final stage, is this idea that these effects really accumulate into, the different stages of the supply chain, and what we see is significant impact on macroeconomic outcomes like reduction in trade costs, more importantly for the UK in economic growth. These are estimates that we found basically in academic and industry reports that they are based on general equilibrium models, so very comprehensive type of models that try to assess multiple layers of trade digitalization, increase in export, reduction in prices, especially for the UK, which is facing, a sticky inflation over the last few years. And just to conclude, what we observe in this exercise is that these effects do not happen automatically. The fact that we have a legal framework doesn't necessarily mean that we are going to optimize the way they impact businesses and the economy. So there is with this disconnects with what Mike just presented and Glenn has been introducing, which is this idea that we need orchestration of this. We need stakeholders to align incentive in a way that we can actually materialize the potential effects that this can have in the UK economy. Thank you.
Okay, so, where's my clicker? Sorry, that was the wrong way. So, my name is Birgit Eichrichter. I'm a lecturer at Surrey Business School. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you also for the talks by Philippe and Mike. I will continue with that, looking at one particular area of UK trade that is of substantial value and volume, actually, and that is the creative industries. 74.9% of total UK exports and 58.8% of total UK imports of services are potentially digitally delivered. And we also looked at British-owned TV programs, music exports, and the UK creative industries more broadly. So it is an area of substantial volume in the UK trade. And we see with the digitalization of content, the distribution has become a lot easier. Content can move easily globally. It doesn't need to pass a physical border in a sense. We can copy across in different countries that digital content is being produced. However, that has given rise to new challenges around copyright and royalty payments. So we were looking at the business model that underpins current business practice of content trading, so buying and selling digital content in a business-to-business environment. And we looked at the challenges that we see in this particular space. We took a case study approach, and we spoke to many experts in that field. We talked to the experts in the media industry, but also in film, also in music, for example. So we really tried to cut across different contexts here. And what we found is actually, it is a quite complex space. First of all, there are many inefficiencies in the process. The systems are often non-interoperable. There are many stakeholders involved in the process. They often have systems that do not really operate with one another. They're siloed, and that creates inefficiencies and very slow processes. We also see challenges related to a lack of diverse content. because there are very few individuals, small companies, but sometimes actually really individuals that decide what type of content is being bought and sold, and then offered, for example, on streaming platforms. The interviewees refer to these individuals as gatekeepers, so that's another challenge in that area. We also see challenges related to user-generated content and content created by very small organizations. That's particularly relevant in the media context. So for example, when we're talking about live streams, what happens to copyright after a live stream has ended? And also, John referred to that at the beginning in the introduction talk. There are challenges related to authenticity of such content. So that's another particular challenge of that area. We also find challenges related to metadata. So metadata is data that basically describes who contributed to a piece of music, for example, and who holds copyrights. And especially in the music industry, that can be quite complex because there are many different stakeholders. There might be a composer, there might be a performing artist, there might be a production company, there might be a record label. They all might hold different copyrights. And the metadata is often not a priority in this creative process of producing a piece of music. But it's very important because if the metadata is not there or if it's incorrect or incomplete, no royalty payments can actually be made. Which already leads to my final challenge that we have identified, and that is actually the complexity of the license agreements in itself. Because there are many different license agreements that are available. So for example, if you want to use a piece of music in a movie or on the radio or in any other commercial context, there are many different license agreements to choose from. There are many people involved in that process. And then what we also see is that actually we have different legislation in the different countries. So while we can move the content easily globally, we have challenges that emerge actually because there's different legislation applying to different countries and different licensing agreements that might apply to different countries. So we see it is a very complex space. There are many challenges. Some of them can be resolved with technology, such as blockchain technology, but others might actually be more difficult to address. And we will, I'm sure, hear more about that in the panel session after. That's it for me. Thank you.
Right, me again, sorry. So I'm standing in for my final year PhD student Carl, who's stuck somewhere in Brussels, excitingly because he started his new job with the Commission advising on matters related to intellectual property, which is a great impact for DECaDE. I'll do my best to explain the PhD work Carl's been involved in. It very much is aligned to this idea I already kind of articulated in the introduction around provenance as an infrastructure really for future creative economy, because once we can establish where content has come from in the supply chain and who owns it, we can start doing things like communicate content rights and ultimately enable licensing and remuneration for the reuse of that content. So the idea of this, as I say, is something that was explored through NFTs. Loads of problems with NFTs. They weren't scalable. The law wasn't there to support their use. People were struggling with the technology and the costs of it. So Carl's PhD really was started from that point, really, and looking at what could be done in many of these respects, particularly around rights and licensing and the discoverability of content. And this was all around about the time that generative AI started to boom. Of course, there are a lot of opportunities in creating new tools with generative AI, but there's a lot of threats as well to the livelihood of creatives whose work is being used to create these models that can then output content a lot very similar to those creators' work. And the idea is, can we turn that into an opportunity for monetization and income for those creators? So we started thinking about rights, first of all, and particularly around this question of opt-in or opt-out. We came up with a series of requirements around these measures. They should certainly be machine readable, because if you're talking about opt-in or opt-out at scale of generative AI training, it isn't enough to sort of do it with natural language disclaimers on websites like "don't scrape my material" and so on. They need to be interoperable, because we need many AI developers to respect them and speak the same language. And as soon as we start talking about machine-readable rights that are interoperable, we're really talking about a protocol, right? A technical standard. And all the better if it's an open one, because it'll minimize friction in its adoption. So this is where things like C2PA come in, that can express this. There's still an open question, of course, being debated around the legal standing and how AI developers should be compelled or encouraged to respect these rights markers that may be attached to content. And there's a kind of a carrot argument where there might be some sort of kite mark that encourages the market to prefer solutions that do respect these markers, through to the stick option, which is of course hard regulation. But in any case, these frameworks need to be based around open standards. As I described, a lot of this work went into the Time to Act report, which communicated sort of technical and policy recommendations around provenance-backed content licensing. So the idea being that a no should mean no and stick with content, but a yes should be granular and be based around content licensing, ultimately with a compensation mechanism. We produced a framework we call Content Arcs that was published early in 2025 that underpinned a lot of the technical recommendations in the ACT report. You can see the layered structure here in the Content Arcs framework very closely mirrors that capability stack I had on the first slide. We have provenance here via open standards that is reinforced through content re-ID schemes like watermarking and fingerprinting. Layered on top of that, we have licensing and identity, and ultimately new ways to generate value through payment gateways, be it crypto micropayments or just traditional payment gateways. I think this was a really exciting and prescient piece of work that Carr did. Work that he also did earlier in the PhD, like DECaDE was the first decentralized registry for AI opt-in and opt-out. That was back in early 2023. And some really interesting work on privacy-preserving search across decentralized repositories of images as well. So there's a couple of posters out there, and I encourage you to go visit them. Pass on to the next speaker.
Thank you. I'm Sadiq, and my presentation covers around reputation and privacy in supply chain. So the scenario here is that in supply chain generally, the government tried as much as possible to provide the legislation and the regulations that protects citizens in terms of what they consume. So the use case we have here is that we have a coffee supply chain where and the reason for this is that coffee is a commodity that is consumed globally, and because it's most being sourced from across continents, so we thought it's a good scenario for us to have this kind of discussion. So we assume that for coffee, which comes from different parts of the world, like Africa and South America, they covers different legislation across different jurisdictions, from where it's coming from and from where it will be consumed. So if you have supply chain entities that want to produce coffee, surprisingly, both the end product and the raw materials have the same name. So interchangeably, I kind of explain what I mean by coffee in the specific instance. So for the raw materials, you have which are being sourced from different countries under different jurisdiction. They are being governed by different legislations, and when it comes down to the consuming side, you're also being governed by different legislation. So for an entity that wants to manufacture the coffee as an end product, they need to go through different processes to ensure that these raw materials comply with the legislation that are from the source country, and they also meet the regulations that have been within the consumption country. But for the suppliers, to prove that to supply chain entity, it becomes a problem, because one is that how will they be able to do that without releasing? How will they be able to gain the trust of the supply chain entity in a transparent way? And how will the supplier be able to do that, secondly, without releasing private business data? And again, you have the policy gap in terms of legislation and jurisdiction that I mentioned earlier. So given in mind that the major thing is that you want a supply chain entity, you want a supplier to be able to prove to a supply chain entity that they are sourcing their raw materials from they follow the regulations whereby they source their raw materials and they don't want to release their private business data, and they want to be sure that they balance the gap in terms of the regulations. We came up with this idea of having these entities, in this case, the supplier, who will have a control of their personal data. So they will have that while being able to prove to supply chain entity that they indeed follow the kind of regulations or legislation that are required for them to be able to do business with a supply chain entity. And they have a verifiable credential that proves that that compliance is done without having to release these private business data. And the reason for that is that we've seen how entities get verifiable credential to prove that they comply with ESG or they don't involve in child labor or they comply with minimum fair wage for their workers. But doing so will mean they will release all the necessary private data that they might not want to do, and which will also jeopardize their competitive advantage. So with self-sovereign identity, which keeps the entity as the center of it, we'll be able to do that because they'll acquire verifiable credential from a verifiable issuer. So the trail of this is that you have an auditor that issues a credential, you then down to the verifier where you'll be able to do the verification process. So this works together, the self-sovereign identity infrastructure works together with zero-knowledge proof, whereby a verifier will be able to prove that they comply or they generate a minimum threshold of revenue without revealing this exact value, or they do business with a trustworthy business company without revealing the exact name of the company itself. So this is how the supply chain trail works. You have the farmer, the processor, or the exporter being able to prove that they are trustworthy to do business with without revealing their personal or private data. So the takeaway from this is that we have a framework that complies with the legislation of data minimization while being able to make a proof that is verifiable. And it's also built on privacy by design, whereby the privacy of entities in the supply chain is an afterthought. It's built from the onset. And again, the very important thing is that the supply chain entity, the supplier, can build their reputation based on trust because they're able to prove that they actually do business with a trustworthy supplier. They have a verifiable credential that is pinned back to a trusted issuer, and that can be verified on a decentralized registry. And it also can reduce the cost of verification, which replaces manual audit, and is cheaper and reliable as well. So we'll have a demo. There's a demo of this verification process at the poster session afterwards. Thank you.
Super. And that's all our talks. Can I invite the panelists to come on up? What we'd like to do now is, hopefully you've heard from our speakers quite the breadth of work. You know, we've had really practice-led work by Mike, who's engaged deeply with government, Felipe, who's been working closely with government as well. A lot of the work has involved practice and across both physical and digital trade. Really what we'd like to do is stimulate a discussion in the room. We're welcoming onto the stage some panelists with deep expertise. I'd like to introduce Nuris. They're sat in the opposite order of what they're on the screen. Who's head of Twin Border Innovation from IOTA. Thank you for joining us. In the middle, we have Nick Davis. They couldn't have sat in more of the wrong order of the trade. Nick Davis, Director of International Centre of Digital Trade and Innovation, former innovation lead of HMRC, and Judy Parnell, Head of Standards Industry and at the BBC. Real depth of talent. Please, if you have any questions, do consider what you might ask. I'm going to ask initially a provocative question, and I'd also ask those in the room to chime in as well. But My first question for you to consider, and please, I'd like to hear all your views. Why don't we have a digital trade border yet? Maybe Nick would like to start.
Yes, that's a long. I could give a long answer to that, but so I think it's a matter of hearts and minds. It's not technology. I think you've seen today that the technology works, and indeed Mike's original RFIT program was back in 2019, got itself into the border strategy, but it hasn't taken off, and it hasn't taken off in the private sector either. The ETDA came in September 2023, and it hasn't moved the dial on digital adoption. We're up from the original 2%. We're up to somewhere like 9 to 10%. That's mainly in the EBL market for the bulk trade. So I think there's a battle of hearts and minds to be won. But the problem is, well, there are a number of problems, but I think the one of the issues is certainly that it's no good doing bits in the middle. It's no good doing an electronic bill of lading or an electronic warehouse receipt or an electronic promissory note if you're not doing the end-to-end process. Ultimately, the whole point of having a supply chain is because somebody wants to buy something, somebody wants to sell something. Set that up digitally through a smart contract, have that data put somewhere very safe, for example, on a distributed ledger, and then have all the other actors who need to see it put in, witness it, so that there's a much closer correlation between the physical world, the Einsteinian digital world in which things only happen once, and the digital world that can reflect that. So there needs to be an end-to-end, there needs to be a clear demonstration of the sorts of benefits that we've just heard about in some of the reports, and there also needs to be policy assurance that this is the way that government sees things developing as well. I don't know whether we've got anybody from government here, but a speech from Sir Chris Bryant would be just right, thank you, just to bolster the work going on here.
Thank you, Nick. What if Muris, I know you've spent time in Cabinet Office and now you're representing a twin border strategy. If you'd like to consider the same question.
I mean, I agree with what Nick said, really. Like, the really boring answer is it's quite hard because it's like a series of small coordination problems and then one really big coordination problem. You have like within organizations, within groups of organizations, within nations, and then across nations that everyone has to agree that we're doing this. And that's quite difficult to do. And I think one of the ways that, and I think lots of the speakers today have spoken about it, that we can try and make that easier is interoperability, so that we don't have to get everyone on one platform or everyone using one type of technology. It's how do we get those things talking to each other. I think the other bit that we collectively, and I sort of talk about the people who are interested in this happening, need to do better is explain this in a better way to the people who it affects. So like, we're all fascinated by decentralized technologies and blockchains and supply chains. If I'm like a producer of cheese, I'm really interested in producing the best cheese and selling it. And like, I don't really care about decentralized technology. It might be really useful for me, but we need to do a better job of explaining how what they're doing now can still work and work better. And I think, Nick, you've been doing some really interesting work with some of the software providers for those people who are on the ground. How do we make it not change much for the people who have to use this on the front end? Because I think if you're asking people to change their whole business process for a fairly nebulous like benefit of things might get better if everyone does this, but not everyone is doing this yet, it's quite hard to convince people to prioritize that above all the other problems that they have to deal with running businesses at the moment. So I think there's a lot of micro problems to try and solve to get to a big end goal that we all want to achieve.
Julie, I know you represent, as Birgit highlighted, a really significant digital trade. Mm. I wonder if you'd like to comment on that.
Yes, so the creative economy is moving digital assets around far more than actually physical assets these days. You know, we don't shift tapes anymore, and we don't shift CDs very much at all. It is all file-based, it is all stream-based. But actually, how do you put that credibility around it? How do you put the the funding models and around it is really how you transform that. There is some level of smart contracts coming in more and more, but often you're dealing with individuals. Well, you're dealing from everything from the individual right up to the global giants, the behemoths of some of those big creative industries, and they all have to work together and they all have to see the value. And I was just thinking as you were talking, actually the term blockchain for many of these people has become disreputable. Because what do they see? Well, they think, well, either it's Bitcoin, and surely that's really precarious. And why would I go into that? And if it's not precarious, isn't it a bit dodgy? Isn't it the way that, that the underworld that actually, some of these really odd industries that there's a bit of a criminal aspect, surely that's what's there. So actually getting that over that reputational barrier, I think is very hard, that people go, yeah, it would be great if there was an easier way to do this and to have micropayments so you could actually think in the longer term about getting fair reward to everybody contributing to a TV program or a music video or a games development in a lot of an easier way with lowering the cost of transactions. But there is a real nervousness, I think, of moving to a lot of these contracts for that reasons.
Thank you. Just to note, if anyone has a point or a question they'd like to pose, do jump in. I saw a hand wave. John?
I outside of the digital creative media, some of the use cases you have are physical goods. You give the example of wine and valuable meat, or agricultural goods as a classic, been around as an idea for a while. The problem seems to me at the analog to digital conversion, where you have something, a property of the physical good, let's say the DNA or the biochemistry or whatever it is, it's a signature of that good, and then you digitize that and that goes through the blockchain. But actually this is the weakness, because that's a new piece of technology you now have to deploy. You have to do the analog digital conversion, right? You can't just record it at the source and have the receiver redo the blood test or whatever. And let me give you an example of a domain where this happens all the time, massive fraud happens, is what WADA do with anti-doping at athletes. It's exactly the same problem. They need to know that an athlete shows up and the blood test they did or the urine test they did are actually that person. So they have to associate. It's exactly the same as biometrics. So you need a secure channel to get from the physical good to the digital. So as part of your end-to-end story, I'd like to know how do we encourage a world, because I like the end-to-end story, but how do we encourage a world where that sort of cyber-physical end-to-end story works, in this supply chain story? I actually buy the digital goods world because we have watermarking and other techniques which are fairly well established and have kind of risk management and quantified problems that they're not, we can fix those. We could do the provenance, but it seems to me that the physical world goods are where you may need some more action somehow.
Yes, I think that's a very good point, John. So taking just a little bit of a step back, I just want to describe what the Electronic Trade Documents and the Digital Property Act enable. They enable the tokenized, the codified representation of property in a good or an asset, and enable me to exchange that atomically with the money that I'm expecting to come from it. In other words, you can tokenize uniqueness. You can tokenize not immutability, and you can ensure that immutability all the way through a complex process, such as the buying and selling of some property in the course of an international transaction. Obviously, you've got that problem at the front end. How do I know that that coffee is ethically produced? Well, who's the person with the biggest incentive to make sure that that coffee is demonstrably ethically produced? It's the seller. So if you can enable the certification. FSA did this, again, about the same time as we were doing RFIT. They managed to tokenize the certification of pork produced in China that was FSA compliant, and that certification flowed with the blockchain capability through the process, and the geo-tracking, the GPS tracking was able to show that the pork hadn't been tampered with on its way through. So you could actually, when it landed at Felixstowe, it was capable of being assured by the Port Health Authority there. So we've got the combination of technologies, that original certification, the tokenization of that certification, the association of it with the physical cargo, that putting of that data into an immutable chain, the contribution of physical confirmation that it's started from the right place, arrived in the right place, and hasn't been tampered with in the middle, so that you actually get that way of demonstrating it. That doesn't mean that you can't falsify stuff at the start, but what I would say is that this gives a compliance trader an easy and cheap way of demonstrating that they are good, that they are meeting the ESG compliance that is heading their way. If we make that like falling off a log, it means that the people who are up to mischief will have a much harder time of it. It's not perfect, but I think we've got a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to take a good step back and say, right, let's stop doing things the way we've always done things since the Phoenicians and the Templars. Let's actually take a step back and apply all our capabilities to make it as straightforward and as risk-free as possible.
Mura, seeing as you're representing Twin.
Yeah, I mean, I think we also just have to recognise like that there are different solutions for different domains. So, like, there is a role to still test animal products as they're entering the country, no matter how much data you have. Like, that's a sensible thing for a country to do. But like you're saying, Nick, we can probably use the resource that we have doing that type of work, and you'll know from HMRC, sort of on the customs side, if we can direct that at the things that are more likely to be fraudulent by having better evidence, more assurance for goods. That doesn't mean that you will never test something that has some provenance based on the blockchain. There might be other good reasons to do it. It might show up in a container that looks a bit dodgy, and that's probably a good reason to check something, right? But it means that you take, if we're only checking, I don't know, 3%, 5%, 10% of consignments coming into the country, if you can shine that spotlight on the things that are more likely to be fraudulent or more likely to be dangerous, then you're doing a better job with the limited resources you have. It's just applying sort of the technology and the better evidence that we have to the specific domain that you're working in. And that's not going to be the same for every industry. It's not going to be the same for digital trade as it is for physical trade, and it's not going to be the same within physical trade for different types of commodity because there's different risks associated with them. It's just how we make the best use of the evidence and the resource that we have to tackle those specific problems in those specific industries.
Judy, the suggestion here is it's not a problem in your area.
Of course it's a problem. I mean, it is the difference of, yes, you can do this right much more easily, taking things to media, but it doesn't mean that you're not going to get fraudulent media. I mean, if I move to the news industry, this word of disinformation and people actually altering what you've got and trying to break those supply chains. So, you know, there is a massive amount of work that has to be done, that even though it says it might say it comes from, it was filmed in Pakistan on the 3rd of March 2026, actually making sure that this was filmed in Pakistan on the 3rd of March 2026 and wasn't filmed in South America 10 years previously. And believe me, that does actually happen. So the tying of the rights and the information and the provenance is as much of a concern to digital assets as it is to physical assets. It's just, it's two sides of the same problem. They can both have very real world consequences, and they become really important to do this. But you have to look at there are similar technologies, there are similar applications of technologies, and John's been talking about CTPA as one of the ways you can do that for binding, but the combination of that and watermarking, there are technologies there that can to help do it. It's actually making sure they are secure enough to keep, so they're easy enough to use, that those who are honest stay honest, and it is not a barrier to entry for use, but actually you're making it a lot harder for the bad actors in whatever industry you're in, whether it's for something physical or whether it's for digital resources.
Thank you. Ooh, lots of hands going up. Let's start over here.
Hi, my name is Adrian Mwonge, based at the Digital and Health Lab in the Roslin Institute in Edinburgh. So with regards to the supply chain, I imagine we have millions of events happening, being read into such systems. I would like to hear from the panel what they think about the scalability and limitations of data, of this volume of data, and how such systems could effectively be operationalized.
Maybe start with Julia, standards.
You can set up standards that will give you as much data as you absolutely like. And in fact, I was having this conversation with Gila in the break. But you always need to know how much metadata and how much data about the data really is of value. There is a point of drowning in too much data. So how do you make sure that what you have matters to the people who are going to be the consumers of that data? I don't need to know every little bit and byte about every bit. And you could, if you've got more metadata than actual payload, it was always a joke we had that the headers and the wrappers always became far too stuffed, that you had far more metadata than you did the actual payload. Well, what's the point of that? That's just becoming bloated, and it's not actually going to be of use to anybody. So I think we really need to have in each of the verticals, each of the industry criteria, what is the important data, what is material to actually the people who are using it. What does it matter when you're tracking your port? What are those things that you actually need to know, rather than everything that you could possibly put there? And that is going to be different for every different area, but I think that's something I think we are really becoming aware of, and the whole area of materiality is something that I think I would put a plea out to you for your academic communities. Please, can you have a look at this for us? What is material? What do we really need to know? What actually matters of the amount of metadata that could be carried?
Thank you. Do you have any further?
Yeah, just sort of to build on that, because I think in physical trade you have sort of both ends of the spectrum. So if you take something like bills of lading, e-bills of lading, it's really important to know quite a lot of data about them, who owns them at any given point in time, because they're basically a document of title. If you have that and you know who has it, they own the goods. At the other end of the spectrum, there's some projects that we've been working on with Port Health authorities in the UK, and they really said we need about 10 pieces of data to do our job properly, and we don't get them at the moment. So there is there is some real work to do to figure out who are the end consumers of this information, what do they need to do that, and then how do we build systems that are capable of producing the e-bill of lading end of the spectrum, or the information sharing network pilot end of the spectrum, which is tiny payloads of data that just help people do their jobs better. And I think it's about that sort of that user research and actually working with the people who are consuming this and figuring out what their needs are. I think is a really important part of this.
Yeah, I'd make 2 points really. One is, I've said this before, so forgive me, but data is not the new oil, it's the new plastic. We generate far too much of it, we use it once, and then we can't dispose of it properly. Stop doing that. We know that if you're unlucky, you have to fill in 36 different documents to get something from one place, from one country to another. 36 different documents. And something like 90+% of all the data on each of those documents, surprise, surprise, is exactly the same. So in what world does that make any sense? Well, I'll tell you what world it makes sense. It's a world in which there are lots of people in the middle making money out of each of those 36 different documents. And there's a lot of people out there, I won't name names, but I'm sure you can imagine who they are, making money out of the paper, complexity, and repetition. So what we've got to take on is that vested interest in keeping things as they are. So there is a sense in which we can, if we take it right back and say, this person here wants to sell this thing to this person here, whether it's a digital asset or a physical asset or a service, just think about what that means. If this person generates all the data that is required at the start, puts it into a safe place and lets everybody else see it, effectively, organisations like my former one, HMRC, can witness that transaction as it happens. Don't need another customs declaration. So let's reduce the amount of data. The second thing about standardisation is there are a number of standards out there that would claim to have global status. WCO, WTO, W3C, ISO, BSI, UN CFACT. I don't think we're ever going to have one standardized format for data. But what we do have, and as we've seen today, is some whizzy AI in the middle that can translate and orchestrate the standardization of those documents, that data, so that things can interoperate. And interoperability is the critical thing. We're not going to have one platform that governs the whole of digital trade, but what we can have is ensure that all those platforms that are out there can interoperate with each other. It's why TradeLens fails, because it didn't interoperate. After hundreds of millions of dollars and 5 years of development, it didn't interoperate. And there are others out there that are in the similar situation. We've got to have interoperability, and I think at least some of that interoperability can be brought about by the sensible deployment of AI. And AI, I think international trade is the best use case for AI. Complex systems that you can't do anything about, but reliable data, thanks to the ETDA. That is where we should be applying AI.
Super, thank you. Please.
So there are various reasons to take a decentralized approach to digital trade rather than relying on a single global supplier. Prominent among them is the monopoly problem that whatever efficiencies are gained from digitization, if there's a single provider, then economic theory tells us they will just translate all of those efficiency gains into profit that will benefit a narrower group of people. But they can also reuse some of that profit for marketing and lobbying, which the decentralized system doesn't have in order to influence the stakeholders who make decisions about the adoption of these technologies. So I'd like to hear from each of you what your best kind of hope is for how to address the economics of centralization versus decentralization.
Joris, this sounds like what you're trying to do.
I think part of it is just it's going to become an imperative, right? Like if you look at sort of, let's not go too far into geopolitics, but like it's going to be very difficult to have a single platform that everyone agrees is a central source of truth for international trade. So that we are sort of going to be pushed towards decentralization, whether anyone sort of decides that we are or not. And you can see this in some of the emerging sort of standards and platforms for things like e-bills of lading. They're already fragmenting. So I think if that's happening anyway, there's sort of an imperative to get in front of it and say, okay, this is going to happen. How do we do this in a way that works for, I mean, from a UK context, UK exporters and importers, for sort of security of critical supply chains. So I think there is almost an incentive that's being created, whether anyone's sort of lobbying for it or not. It's already on the way. I think the other part of it is that there's a more literal interpretation of decentralization, which is like, how do we move engagement with this type of digital trade to where people are already working? So how do we get SMEs doing digital trade by getting them to produce data instead of PDFs? And that's like pushing that down through multiple different systems that are producing this information and connecting them up through the interoperability that Nick was talking about. And I think that's in some ways like a more difficult challenge to get that information into the system. But I think the technology is there to do it. The challenge is like, how do we make the business process change, and how do we support businesses to get through that?
Yeah, I think the analogy I would invite you to consider is the internet. Internet broadly free to use. I know there are some nasty things going on with the people who are too prevalent in the internet, but imagine if we had an internet for trade, a subset of the internet in which I could assert my identity that Steve and his team have already been looking at, and then I could safely transact over that internet as a piece of public digital infrastructure. The nearest we've got to an authority on digital trade globally is the Digital Standards Initiative in Singapore, in the ICC, WTO, WEF. They say 5 things we need. Legislation, got it. Standards, they're emerging. Education, that's an ongoing challenge, but we'll keep doing it. A solution for digital identity, Steve's got one. And the last thing we need is public digital infrastructure. Public digital infrastructure. And that's really what the IC4DTI, just to blow our own trumpet, is trying to do, is to try and be the guardians. We're a community interest company, and we want to establish that internet for trade so that any SME can log on and access the sort of capabilities that we've been talking about today, probably through their existing ERP system providers, so that it's not a new change, it's not a big investment, it's something that they can save their documents as ETRs rather than as PDFs, as you mentioned. I think if we can have that as neutrally owned and governed digital infrastructure in the middle to which everybody has broadly free access, then I think that's the sort of model that we're looking for.
With the digital community, we're exchanging media, but we have come up with, between us, a small number of file formats which we use, and that's almost worked. Some of it has been, a few companies will come together and they'll go around a particular standard, and it really has come with a bit of the de facto use of certain standards and certain formats. If you pull down, what is your photo file format, you will find a huge list of formats that you use. The vast majority you'll be exchanging JPEGs. Actually, I think what we'll find more and more is that the business side as well will come down to a small a reducing number of formats that become almost those de facto standards from the standards that are chosen, just because it's an awful lot easier and it's an awful lot cheaper, and it will be driven by the economics of supply chain. When you are a many-to-many industry like we are, you find that you automatically will start to merge around those common points for those exchange, because it just makes life an awful lot easier, and you're not having to have as many translations into your own corporate business systems. So suddenly everything starts to simplify, and I think we'll find this. It might be led by, I imagine, certain of the big conglomerates, and business advisors might push organisations corporately to a certain number of reducing choices, but I think that what we'll find is there will be ones that pragmatically work. It will probably end up with, as we always have, maybe it's not the best, but it is the pragmatic solution that works.
I have a question right at the back.
Hello, my name's Gaynor Flynn. I'm a creative industry professional, 40 years in the sector. I would argue we've already got an internet for trade in my sector, but the problem is that it's not us that's getting the right to revenue. It's those big tech companies, be they Meta, Google et al. And that's my idea of the hell realm, that those people take control of this data and provenance. And until we collectively in our sector unite to get a fair share, and that's linked to any form of digital data, which to be honest we have in zeros and ones, that's more about a will to share ad revenue. It's not a free internet. Most of the internet is driven by a massive multi-billion, trillion-pound ad revenue model and data gold. And as content creators, which we all are, there's 300 million of us now, I think we all probably put something on LinkedIn. Hello, you're a writer, you're a photographer, and you're a filmmaker. We all deserve a share of that revenue. And I think we have to have this conversation within that wider context of the elephant in the room. Big tech doesn't pay or play fair. And how are we going to fix that and link that to a digital system that rewards the creative industries and quality content?
Yeah, that's a very good point, well made and passionately made too. But I think that's the point, is that we have an opportunity here to take a big step back from the way that we currently do things and the way that we've done things for some time, and actually say, right, how would you set up a smart legal contract to operate, to enable you as a creative producer to realize a fair share of the gains that you are entitled to.
So with respect, what I'm saying is that comes secondary to any contract that's fair. The smart legal contract is secondary. The provenance is in my, I know this is like negating the whole point of the day, but until we have just an actual agreement with these big tech companies about our rights to revenue, it doesn't matter whether it's a smart or stupid contract, we're not going to get that share. Unless that's embedded. I just looked at one of the institutes that are controlling one of the models we saw this morning. You know, it's led by Google, Meta. Yep. They're not going to pay us fairly unless we push back. So in the context of that smart system and adoption, non-adoption, the main point is the actual agreement and us becoming more aware that they need to change their business models and play fairer. Does that make sense? It's a secondary issue, the smart contract. And because you can have a perfectly working system with perfect data, which we've all agreed on, but unless the point of revenue, I'm talking about creative industry content now, is distributed equally in some form of more open and transparent way, which needs good old-fashioned laws and pushback from us individually, then it's all irrelevant.
All I can say is you must have been listening to the conversations that we have, my colleagues and I have, who are in the room very regularly. I mean, as BBC's, I come from our research and development department, and this is something that we are really aware of with our charter obligations to be working for the benefit of the UK and wider creative economy. Your voices we are doing our very best to push your voices in the technology areas and push back on some of these areas. Yes, we are, it is something that we are really trying to...
And please come and say hello to me, anyone that's interested in this space. I'm based at the Royal College of Art Innovation Lab. I am building the tools with my own company to push back, because I've campaigned for 25 years and it hasn't, big tech haven't paid fairly. Government, it is impossible for them to catch up. So if anyone wants to help, just come and seek me out. Gaynor O'Flynn on LinkedIn. My company's beinghuman.com, like human being the other way around.
Thank you. Another question? Yes, Rob.
Perhaps in response to the previous questioner, why do we have to root through incumbents to create a new economy?
We just have to start from where we're at. That's the problem. We need scale up, and we need to consider what is as Maurice said, what's the current thing? How did SMEs trade now? They go onto they log onto their laptops of a Friday and they do their invoicing and their purchase ordering through an existing ERP system. So a way to get to those, there are something like 350 million SMEs globally that have some sort of digital footprint. Getting to all 350 million of them is tricky. There are 140 platform providers that cover something like 90% of those. So if we get those 140 odd platform providers to provide a mechanism by which they can save their documents as ETRs, It means that the data that they're producing suddenly becomes much more utilitous to them, if there is such a word, and they can actually execute on the legal provisions of the ETDA through a simple entry in their existing ERP system. That's how you get there in the first place. And then if you want broader disruption, which I agree is within prospect, and I think it will have an effect on the previous questioner's issue as well, then you can do that. But you're not going to do that tomorrow. You've got to work with what you've got, and you've got to scale it up and get that network effect that would then increase the momentum behind the sort of decentralized capabilities that we've heard about today.
I think the other thing that sort of feeds into this conversation, and I think there's a bit of a movement towards it, is the use of sort of open source solutions. So Twin, the program that I'm working on, is open source. We've seen sort of national governments taking that direction. So, I mean, Estonia have been doing this for 20 years or more, and I think that is, spreading. I think there was the Danish government have moved to open source technology as well, and that removes some of these commercial incentives. It's not a panacea, right? It's a difficult thing to do. It requires will, it requires effort to build those things in a way that suits your organization. And I don't think we can expect everybody to do that, but it's part of the puzzle. And it's how do we make those sort of open source solutions as accessible to organizations as possible. So that's another part of the challenge, I think.
Some of the things I'm thinking of, there have been parts of the world where, perhaps in some of the areas in the global south, where actually hasn't been the incumbent solutions. And actually they've been able to take a step ahead. And so actually you'll find the creative economy, particularly around, and the use of smart contracts and use of ledger technology for this funding is actually, because there isn't that same establishment of the long legacy, they've been able to take that step ahead, and there are projects going on in different parts of the world. I think we need to actually look perhaps at some of the other economies and stuff that's going on that is really innovative, where we've gone, oh, don't worry, we know, we've got all the solutions. Actually, maybe we need to look at where some areas which traditionally we would have thought were followers actually are leading us because they've been able to make this tech jump.
Could you name names? That was my question. Could you name economies which we should be looking at?
So I mean, I'm going to give a solution, an example of some work that, for instance, Idris Elba is looking with the creative economies in West Africa and looking at actually the use of how you can use ledger technologies for really funding that and actually using a new technologies there. And I can, if you talk to me later and give me your details, I can get you some contacts on that.
Mike?
Sorry, it builds on this conversation. Maybe you mentioned Singapore, and my research, looking at other economies, demonstrates that you can change the way the quarters operate. But one of the challenges is that government doesn't change. So government departments don't share information, so there's no integration of process. How much of that do you see?
How long have I got? No.
Minus a minute.
Yeah. So don't start with government. Start with design it for the outside in.
Sorry, but everything that industry does, they can do everything. But if government is not joined up, it won't work.
Yes, I agree with that. So
Singapore,
yes.
Estonia.
Yes. Estonia is the size of Leeds. Singapore got a very autocratic nation state. Yes, or Chinese, if only we had that sort of regime and I was in charge, it would be great. No, it is an issue. So all we can do is to continue to push on this. As we know from yourself, the single trade window program 180 million it was supposed to be costing, solving the government problem on its own, without recognising that it's exactly the same problem in the commercial world. We need to keep lobbying government, I think, to get behind this. The trade strategy and the industrial strategies are actually encouraging. It's just that it's not quite clear where they stand now as regard. They remain committed to the objectives of single trade window without actually doing anything to deliver. So we just need to keep going with government, and hopefully at some point it will all come together and we'll make some progress.
Can we just,
It is, absolutely. Yep. Just look at M-Pesa, you know.
We have a thought from Eurus on this, having been embedded in this for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the challenges are recognised in government, right? Like there are all the challenges we've spoken about on the industry side are equally true for government. There's no one wants to collect the same data 50 times. No one's benefiting from that. It's just as sort of where we started. Like it's a big coordination problem, and there are separate objectives that those organisations need to fulfil. But I completely recognise the challenge, Mike, and as you say, like a lot of what industry does is driven by the requirements set by government. I agree with what Nick said. Like I think we do need to look at what both Nick and Judy say. We need to look at other economies, but we shouldn't look at them in Singapore has done this, so we should do that, because all these economies have different structures. They have different governance models. For physical trade, they operate in completely different ways. But there are definitely things that we can learn and implement that other countries have done, and we should be as open as possible to doing that, because the last thing we should do is try and sort of reinvent the wheel and think that we're starting from scratch and no one else has solved these problems. Everyone's trying to solve the same problem, and actually it's probably beneficial if we all come up with broadly similar solutions, because then we can talk to one another as well as just within our own government systems.
Final thought from Judy?
Please just make it easier. If you're a big just being a big organisation such as the BBC, it's really hard. We've got all these stuff that's grown up over for us 100 years. You know, I don't envy trying to do it factored up by a scale of N by government. It's just really, really hard. But start small. Do a little bit first rather than trying to go in and do the whole thing at the same time.
Super. First, I'd really like to thank our panellists for being so engaging in the usual way. I'd really like to thank my team. We've heard from Birgit, Felipe, Mike, Sadiq spoke. Also, we've got Senmar in the room if you want to wave to people. Shishu's sitting at the back there if you want to wave to people. Do talk to them during the lunchtime. They've got so much wealth of knowledge. I mean, Mike's been doing this for, 10 years now? Nearly 10 years in trying to implement this. Clearly, there's a lot of debate in the room, and we could talk about this for a long time, but we do have lunch now, so let's talk over lunch. Please interact with the team, and thank you all so much for being so engaging. Thank you.